I'm James Andrews. I'm a reporter of Food Safety News. I'm here at IAFP 2013. I'm with Dr. Michele J. Russell. She's a researcher at University of California, Davis in the Western Center for Food Safety. What are you doing here? What's going on at IAFP?
Well, I'm out here with a couple of my students, and we have posters. And I also gave an oral presentation yesterday and an exciting session on wildlife and issues around food safety.
Could you talk about the posters really quick? What's going on with those?
Sure, those are actually tomorrow afternoon, and one is with a graduate student doing his master's in preventive veterinary medicine. He's a veterinarian, and he did a study of aquatic wildlife in farm ponds in southeastern Georgia. And the farm ponds were used to irrigate blueberries and lettuce, cantaloupe, different. It's a mixed produce growing region, and we were studying the occurrence of salmonella in these ponds.
Okay, and I've spoken to you several times on the phone. This is the first time meeting you in person, but we've talked a lot about wildlife contamination on produce. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the impact of wildlife on food safety, or how wildlife relate to food safety.
Sure. Wildlife are one of several sources that can cause microbial contamination of produce. And the first time wildlife were of a concern, I would say, in the produce food safety world were in the mid-90s after the Odwalla apple juice outbreak. One of the environmental findings in the orchard was a deer were in the orchard and dropped apples were used. And so there was a concern that because deer are a known carrier of E. coli 0157, that they were the source. They never found the genetic fingerprint that matched the smoking deer, so to speak, but they definitely, farmers began to be concerned, that was a potential source because these bacteria come from animals, usually from livestock like cattle, but wildlife and birds can also carry salmonella, campylobacter, and since through the 90s, there have been several outbreaks that I talked about yesterday that wildlife were investigated as one of the possible sources, either directly contaminating the crop by defecating on it or by defecating and contaminating the water that's used for irrigation.
Like strawberries in Oregon recently.
Right. Actually, that paper from Oregon, the Oregon Health Department just published the paper describing a really sad outbreak that was associated with strawberries sold at roadside stands. And during that investigation, they found that a deer population was grazing in the strawberry fields.
And then there was the issue with the spinach in 2006 that might have been connected to the feral pigs around there.
Right, in the spinach outbreak, which I actually worked on, I was with the California Department of Public Health at the time, and what we found on that particular ranch was multiple possible sources. So the feral pigs that were carrying the outbreak strain, as well as cattle, and the surface water had the outbreak strain, and the agriculture well had some vulnerabilities. So we're not sure if there was an intrusion into the field or if it was the water, but we knew there were multiple possible sources, including the feral pigs on that ranch.
Because of all this possible wildlife contamination or proven wildlife contamination in some cases, there have been certain measures taken by food buyers, like big grocery stores or restaurant chains or things like that, wanting certain measures taken by farmers who are growing sensitive crops to keep wildlife away from the food. And there's been some concern. There was a paper published recently discussing the fact that there's been some environmental degradation directly linked to measures to try and keep the food safer. And there's a bit of controversy about that, and I was wondering if you felt that farmers and food manufacturers were taking a responsible route with trying to mitigate wildlife contamination, or if they might be going a little overboard, like with maybe clear cutting too much, or possibly poisoning sensitive wildlife. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, my thought, and I speak mostly from the California perspective, although I do have some research projects in Arizona and Georgia, but I mostly know about the Salinas Valley area, which is a major production area for specialty crops, including the leafy greens. And I work directly with farmers who are very generous in allowing us to actually do research on their properties. And I found the farmers I've come across are very conservation oriented, and the same thing with the cattle ranchers. Some of them are part of the Nature Conservancy with their lands, and so it's taken very seriously as far as when there has to be an intervention related to wildlife. And I think it's important to also realize there's different approaches. One is, for example, the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement. And the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement mostly focuses their audits on taking measures, first of all, knowing where you're planting your crop, doing an assessment, making sure you're not putting in a sensitive crop right in the middle of a wildlife corridor. But second of all, the real problem is not the presence of wildlife, it's the feces in the field. And that's what caused the Oregon outbreak. It was the feces in the field. And so there's measures. That's actually our second poster tomorrow, is looking at metrics. So if you do have an entry into the field, how can you make sure that produce doesn't get to the consumer, that it's removed safely. And where you do run into issues is when you have chronic problems. If the deer keep coming in, if the pigs keep coming in, birds are very difficult. Pigs and deer, you can generally put up fencing. That can even just be temporary hot wire fencing during the growing season. It doesn't have to be a permanent fence. But you deal with the problem for that crop at that time. And each site's going to be a little different, a different species. That's what makes it so difficult. It's harder than, for example, eggs, where you have hen houses and you're mostly worried about rodents. So you've got one animal, basically, one group of animals to worry about, mostly mice. Whereas in these fields, great big crop fields, it could be anything from birds to reptiles to pigs and deer and even stray domestic dogs. So, the growers, I think the biggest thing possibly lacking is making sure that the growers and the auditors and the buyers are hooked up to the right wildlife professionals, so that when they do mitigate, they're using the best method they can and avoiding these issues of using too much poison or possibly coming into conflict with some of the conservation practices related to water quality.
What might be some of those, in your opinion, best practices to use when you're trying to mitigate wildlife contamination?
Well, I think, first of all, having the farm workers are really your first line of defense, having them observe what's going on in the field. And the most vulnerable time, what our research and others have shown doing field trials, is right before harvest, especially if you're using overhead sprinkling. So if you have a contamination in the field, it's going to splash and move it around. So we've learned the growers need to be hyper diligent during that time period in particular. And it really varies depending on what the species is. If they're really getting into the field and you're having crop damage and fecal material, then you do need to do something, unless the field's just going to be disked under. Like I said, typically that would be, it might be some kind of a fencing approach. It might be a scare tactic. I know that I was down in Yuma, Arizona, where they have a lot of birds, and they basically drive ATVs around and use noisemakers to scare the birds out of the fields.
One more thing I wanted to make sure we discussed was the fact that I didn't want listeners to come away thinking this was a really common occurrence. We were really worried about, feral pigs or deer running rampant and pooping on crops all the time. So I know that it's generally a rare occurrence, the wildlife issue, and I was wondering if you could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, well, in terms of having an actual outbreak, there's many hurdles that take place from the field going into the processing area, having the cold chain available. So these outbreaks are incredibly rare that trace back to a possible wildlife source. The intrusions, the crops are growing outdoors, so you're going to have birds flying by, but there are steps in place, and so again, I would call this. It's just one possible source, and most of the time, it's going to be a low risk, and it's just when you have that perfect storm of the intrusion and then the possible failures downstream before it gets to the consumer where you end up with an outbreak. But right, there's not pigs running rampant through the fields.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Do you have any other commentary about wildlife or food safety stuff going on at IAFP for our audience before I let you go?
Well, I would just say we had a good session yesterday, and I think we're, again, bringing together some of the right people. There was wildlife biologists there as well as food safety people, and people are talking, and I think, this area will improve. These contamination events related to wildlife are actually incredibly rare, but it's what I call a low probability but really high consequence event. But I do believe they're preventable with being diligent, and I also believe that it's possible to reach balance and keep our conservation practices going without also having the worry about another outbreak like the strawberry outbreak.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. J. Russell, for speaking with me for a few minutes.
Okay, sure. Thank you.